Hi Nine, welcome back. We are now on lesson 3. Before we get started with this week's case study, we're going to start with a quick fire round, thinking about what you learned last week all about India. So pause the video, work your way through these 5 questions without your fact sheet, then have a quick look, see if you can add any extra info before moving on with the rest of the lesson. Here is a partly filled in fact sheet for India with a few key facts and figures for you to just double check that you've got those all correct. So look through the key facts and the percentages for the industry sector in particular and make sure that they're loosely similar. And then if you're missing any info in terms of multinationals or imports and exports, you can add that to yours as well. So just double check that they line up and are similar before moving on with the rest of today's lesson. So lesson 3 today, we are going to be looking at Malawi. So what you'll need is the same as what you've had for the other lessons, your fact book, a pen or something to write with, and some scrap paper. As always, it's really useful to start off thinking about locations of places so we got an understanding of where it is that we are talking about. And again, we're coming back to my clock idea because I think it's really useful way to describe different places and a good habit to get into ahead of your GCSEs. So if you didn't know, Malawi is in Africa. That is the continent of Africa that you can see on your screen, and then Malawi has got a little arrow to it towards sort of the bottom right hand side of Africa. You can see that there's a few lines of latitude labelled on that map that you can include in your descriptions, as well as some oceans. Here we've got another map that just shows you some of the countries that are surrounding Malawi to include in your descriptions as well. So pause the video and have a go at writing your description using the clock idea. Okay, just a few things to point out. So we've got the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn, and Malawi is pretty much in between both of those. So when you're talking about lines of latitude, you could say that Malawi is in between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn. We've also got the Indian Ocean to the east of Malawi, so you could have included that as well. The countries at the top that you could have include Zambia, Tanzania, Mozambique, remembering to use our northeast, southwest compass points if you can to describe more specifically where those countries are. And finally, the continent is Africa, so that should be in your description somewhere. Make sure that you've got a few of those points that I've just highlighted in your description. If not, then go back and amend it before moving on. So Malawi's climate then, you should already be thinking, well, it's somewhere between the equator and the Tropic of Cancer. So in your head, you should be thinking like a geographer that it's going to be a lot warmer than it is here in the UK because of its position where it is in the world. So it's got what we call a subtropical climate. So it is relatively dry, but has some different seasons throughout the year, which we can look at the climate graph in a second. So it has a warm, wet season from November to April, where it gets 95% of its annual rainfall. So just in those few months, it gets a lot of its rainfall. It's not like the UK, where it's a bit more consistent throughout the year. So they have a cool, dry winter season in May to August. Remember, it's in the southern hemisphere, so their sort of summer and winter seasons are the opposite to ours. And then it has a hot, dry season just in September, October, where temperatures go between 25 and 37 degrees Celsius. So if you have a look at the climate graph to the right hand side of the slide, remember temperature is the line graph and rainfall is the bar chart. So you can see that the temperature drops quite dramatically in June and July, and then it increases again in October and November. Whereas rainfall, there's hardly any rainfall in the months June, July, August, September, and a lot more in sort of January, February time when this wet season is. So using that information that I've spoken about, can you complete the climate section in your fact book? Again, try and challenge yourself and include some specific data that you can read from the climate graph if you can. So next up, ecosystems. Malawi has a really diverse relief, soil and climate. What we mean by relief is just the kind of general landscape. Soil is going to lead to different plants being grown there, and climate, from the last slide, we saw that it has quite a rainy, wet season and then drier parts as well, which is going to impact the types of things that you would find in the ecosystems. So there's 3 ecosystems that can be found in Malawi, sort of big ones. Lake Malawi, which you might have noticed on the map on the location slide, runs all down the east of the country, and here you find different swamps and lagoons which bring about different ecosystems. There's also some savanna and some deciduous forests as well, but all of these have been negatively impacted by humans. So the swamps, for example, have been drained and cultivated, so that means that the water's been removed from them and instead they've been used to grow crops and used for farming. Woodland has been cleared for agriculture and farming as well, so you could link this into the idea of deforestation if you've heard that term before. And rivers have been dammed to irrigate crops. So this is the idea that they'll stop the flow of the river at certain points and instead redirect that water to where their crops are so they grow a little bit better. So if you think about the climate graph and how there's those really dry months in sort of June and July, then farmers might rely on this type of thing to make sure that their crops are still getting watered even when it doesn't rain. And game animals are only found in game reserves. And what we mean by game animals are things such as elephants, zebras, giraffes, lions, things like that. They're only now found in game reserves, which are a bit like national parks to protect them from being poached or being hunted. So what I want you to focus on for this case study is Lake Malawi, because it's really, really interesting, really, really diverse, and you can find lots of interesting facts out about it, I think. So it's home to things like hippos, crocodiles, and endemic fish. And what that means is fish that can only be found in Lake Malawi in the whole world. So you wouldn't be able to find those types of fish sort of naturally anywhere else. It's also a part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so it's protected, so it limits the types of things that people are able to do there now. So have a read around, do some research, and maybe write a few sentences in your fact book about Lake Malawi as an ecosystem. Moving on, looking at our key facts then and our different development indicators. So in Malawi, the average age of someone is 18. So they have a really, really young population there. So what does that mean for things like jobs, families, education, all those types of things? Do you think it's going to mean that it's a LIC or a HIC? So life expectancy, does it vary for men and women? The GNI, how does this compare to the UK and India? As I said last week, you should be thinking about all these different case studies in relation to each other. So which country has better or worse, higher or lower statistics, and what does that mean in terms of its development? Thinking back to our development topic that we already did in year 9. And then finally, the HDI, this was quite interesting to find out that actually it increased by 60% to what it was from 1990 to 2018, but despite that it's still ranked 172 out of 189 countries. So it's developed and it's done better, however it's still not great when you compare it to other countries. So use the websites that you've used over the past couple of weeks in your fact book. I've also included one at the top there if you've been struggling to find some of these things out, and include those in your fact book. Okay, next up we have trade. So Malawi imports more than it exports, so it takes in more goods than it sells to other places. And you might expect that sometimes with a less developed country. So some of the top exports, so things that it sells to other countries, include raw tobacco, tea, nuts, sugar, and soybean meal. So if you think about the list that you created for the UK and India, how are they different and how might this impact the country's economy? Well, if we think to the different industry sectors, a lot of this is sort of farming and that primary sector that we talk about. So Malawi is able to get all these raw materials. However, them in their rawest form doesn't necessarily mean that they're worth very much money. So what often happens is these types of materials are exported and sold to other countries who then make them into the actual thing. So the tobacco is sold and then made into cigarettes, which you can sell for much more money. Or tea is sold to somewhere else. It's then put into tea bags, put on our shelves, and then is sold for a lot more money. So it means that Malawi isn't making that much money, even though they're creating these raw materials. And then if we look at the imports, so things that it brings into the country, these include things such as medicines, broadcasting equipment, filing cabinets, delivery trucks, and iron, but not an iron that you'd iron your clothes with, like iron that is used for building materials. So quite a lot of the things, when we looked at the UK and India, there were similar things on the import and export list, but these are drastically different for Malawi. So why do you think this could be? If you remember back at the location of Malawi, it is a landlocked country. So that means that it's got some limitations on the types of goods that can come in and out of it. So it doesn't have big shipping ports like the UK has because it's an island, or India has because it's surrounded by the sea. It's not surrounded by anything. So everything has to be transported either by air, which Malawi doesn't have the best infrastructure for because it is a less developed country, or it has to come from road. So you might get goods being imported into Tanzania, for example, which is a neighbouring country, and then is taken all the way through the road to get there. So it's quite an interesting one to look at and compare to, and you should, as a good geographer, start thinking about how this differs to sort of richer countries like the UK. So thinking about some of those things that we've just spoken about and using the examples on this slide, can you fill in that part of your fact sheet, please? So looking at industry and multinationals then, over 80% of the population in Malawi are involved in subsistence farming, but that only accounts for 27% of what we call GDP. So that's how much a country makes throughout a year. So we've got a lot of people in the country working in farming, but actually they're not making too much money from it. It's just over a quarter of all the money that the government make comes from what 80% of the people that live there do. So that's not great, and that's not helping the development of the country. So the services, or the tertiary quaternary sectors, accounts for way more. That accounts for over half of the GDP of the country, but based on basic maths, there's 20%, if that, that's working in that particular sector. So way less people working in it, but they get a lot more money from it. And then finally, manufacturing, or the secondary sector, accounts for 11% of the GDP. So you can have a rough guesstimate of what percentages there are in each of those different sectors, but use the websites in your fact book to try and find out the specific ones for Malawi. Okay, looking at multinationals, it was quite tricky to find these because it is a low-income country, so there isn't tons and tons of multinationals working there. So I've written a list down here to help you a little bit of some of these that are from Malawi. However, there's some other multinationals that still operate and have premises over there. So you can maybe look into these 5 as a starting point and decide whether they're a Malawian multinational or whether they're from elsewhere in the world but are just operating within Malawi. But also, an interesting fact for you guys to know is that there's no McDonald's in Malawi. So a lot of African countries don't actually have McDonald's because there's not a need for them. If you think quite a lot of the people might be quite poor in Malawi, then they're not going to be able to afford McDonald's. So imagine living in a world where you can't go to McDonald's as often as you want. So have a go completing this section on your fact sheet around the multinationals. Next up then is global cities. Well, what do you think? Do you think Malawi has any global cities? I bet most of you can't even name a city that's in Malawi. So that's leading me to think that probably Malawi doesn't have any, which is correct. It doesn't have any global cities. So if you remember back to the first lesson, I explained that global cities are the most important cities in the world because of factors such as economics. So they're important for money, for trade, for education. They've got good transport links, all of those things. So Malawi doesn't necessarily have all of that yet, so that's why it's not able to be a global city. So if we look into, well, why isn't Malawi able to have any global cities? So it's links into its sort of history. So Malawi used to be part owned by the British. So it used to be under what we call colonial rule. And this is the idea that sort of hundreds of years ago, we sent people over to different countries to explore. But then essentially we took over those countries, took control, took rule, and decided what was happening there. And actually we exploited a lot of the people that lived in those countries. So in Malawi, for example, we would have taken goods like tobacco and tea and sent them back to Britain, or places that we could have transformed them into more usable goods, and actually not paid the people there fairly, and sort of reinvested into the country. So that's why quite a lot of the countries that used to be under colonial rule are much poorer than their European countries that colonized them. But it did get independence in 1964, which in the grand scheme of things wasn't that long ago. But the real reason why it's not got a global city is because it's got a really poor economy, so it doesn't have that much money in terms of a country. And this is partly because it's landlocked, so it doesn't have any sea near it. It's heavily populated. It's got a really big population for the size of it, and it's what we call mineral poor, so it doesn't have things such as precious rocks and diamonds and things like that that are worth a lot of money, and it doesn't have things like oil or coal that we can take out of the ground to use for energy. So as a result, it's depended really, really heavily on foreign aid. So different governments and countries sort of giving it money to help support its development. So does Malawi have any global cities? No, but it's not necessarily Malawi's fault. A lot of it links back to its sort of historical links and British colonial rule, and how we didn't necessarily help them out maybe as much as we should. So in your fact book, can you write maybe a sentence or two explaining why Malawi doesn't have any global cities, but it might do in the future? And finally, then we're on to our interesting fact slides. So here are a few facts that I found out about Malawi putting this lesson together. So Lake Malawi is nicknamed Calendar Lake because at its longest point, it's 365 miles long, and at its widest point, it's 52 miles wide, because we have 365 days in a year and 52 weeks in a year. So that's why it's called Calendar Lake. So brands such as Twinings and PG Tips use tea that comes from Malawi. The capital of Malawi is Lilongwe, if you didn't know that. And Malawi is said to be safer than England and the USA on certain sort of polls and research putting different countries into categories. So you can use some of my ideas for interesting facts or things that you've picked up throughout this lesson, or you can do a little bit of your own research to add to that section of your fact book. Okay, finally, what do you need to know? So just like the other two lessons, you need to make sure that all of your fact sheets are complete. So pause, go back, look over this lesson if you need to, and make sure that all of those boxes are filled in. Then read through, try and learn all the information about the different categories. Again, if there's someone at home that can test you, that'd be really, really useful. And then, as before, we're going to start next lesson with a quick recap and quiz about what you've learnt this week on Malawi before we start our next lesson. Good luck, Year 9, and I'll see you next week.